There is a kind of person who never loses an argument. They always have the better point, the sharper memory, the cleaner logic. In almost every disagreement, they find their way to solid ground while the other person scrambles. And yet something keeps going wrong. The relationships don't hold the way they should. The conversations end but not cleanly. People stop pushing back not because they're convinced but because they've grown tired. This is not about intelligence. It is not about being wrong factually. In fact, the person we're describing is often right, provably, demonstrably right. And that is precisely what makes this so difficult to see. Because when you are right, when the evidence supports you, when your reasoning is sound, when the timeline confirms your version of events, it becomes almost impossible to consider that being right might be the thing that's costing you the most. This episode is not about losing. It's not about backing down. It is about something quieter and harder than either of those things. She had been in the relationship for 4 years. By almost any measure, she was the more thoughtful partner. She remembered conversations. She tracked patterns. When something went wrong, she could reconstruct the sequence of events with enough detail that her partner rarely had a response. He would grow quiet, sometimes frustrated, sometimes just resigned, and she would feel, briefly, the satisfaction of having made her case. But something had shifted over the past year, though she couldn't name it exactly. He had started agreeing with her faster, not in the way that felt like genuine understanding, more like a door closing quietly. He would say, "Okay," and the conversation would end. She told herself this was progress, that he was finally learning, that the arguments had worn him down into something like clarity. It wasn't until a friend asked her, almost gently, whether she ever let him be right about anything, that she felt something unfamiliar move through her. Not guilt, not quite, more like a question she hadn't been willing to ask herself. She replayed the last several months, the moments when he had offered a different read on something and she had redirected him, patiently, carefully, the way you correct someone you're trying to help. She had believed in those moments that she was being honest. That honesty was a form of care. But she hadn't asked herself what he felt when she did it. Not really. The thought sat with her longer than she expected. She didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't sure it meant anything, but it stayed. There is a distortion that becomes nearly invisible when you are genuinely right. It works like this. Because your reasoning is sound, you come to trust your reasoning absolutely. Because your memory is accurate, you treat your memory as the standard. Because you have been correct before, you begin to approach each new situation already oriented toward a conclusion. You are not being dishonest, but you are doing something that functions like prejudgment without the discomfort of calling it that. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. The person on the other side of you is not wrong about everything. They have observations you haven't considered. They have an experience of the conversation that you are not fully accounting for. But by the time they try to offer it, the framing has already been set. You are the one who reasons carefully. They are the one who feels things imprecisely. That hierarchy doesn't have to be spoken. It is already present in how the conversation moves, in how quickly you respond, in the tone that carries the assumption that you already know where this is going. Picture a moment where someone you're close to starts a sentence and you can already feel yourself categorizing it. You know this pattern. You've heard something close enough to it that your mind files it without waiting for the end of the thought. You listen technically. But internally, you have already arrived at your response. You are waiting for a pause, not an understanding. And the effect, the felt experience on the other side, is something closer to not being heard at all. Socrates noticed this in Athens. He spent years in conversation with people who were confident in their knowledge, generals, poets, politicians, craftsmen, not foolish people, capable, accomplished people. And what he found, almost universally, was that the confidence they carried was not equal to the understanding they actually had. They knew their domain, but they had extrapolated from that knowledge a kind of general authority over truth that hadn't been earned. The distortion was not stupidity, it was certainty arriving before examination. And what made it so difficult to expose was that the people who held it were not wrong about everything. They were often right about specific things, which made the leap from "I am right about this" to "I am right, therefore" nearly undetectable from the inside. The general who knew strategy assumed he understood justice. The craftsman who knew his trade assumed he understood virtue. The confidence was real. The competence was real. Only the boundary between them was missing. You've probably felt the pull of this yourself, not in a dramatic way, in the small, daily way. The way a familiar pattern makes you sure before you've actually listened. The way being right last time makes you less curious this time. And the way that reduced curiosity, that narrowing of openness, rarely announces itself. It just becomes the water you both swim in. Socrates did not teach by correcting people. This is worth sitting with because it runs against what we assume expertise looks like. He didn't walk into a conversation, identify what was wrong, and replace it with what was right. He asked questions, specific, patient, increasingly precise questions. And he asked them not because he didn't know the answers, but because he understood something about knowledge that most people resist. That a conclusion received is not the same as a conclusion understood. He called it the alenctic method, a process of examination through dialogue, and its purpose was not to make the other person feel foolish. It was to bring them into genuine contact with the edges of what they actually knew and what they only thought they knew, what they had inherited from reputation, what they had confused with instinct, what they had repeated so many times it had started to feel like bedrock, even when the foundation beneath it hadn't been tested. The insight that Socrates returned to again and again was this: the most dangerous kind of ignorance is not the kind that knows it is ignorant. It is the kind that has mistaken familiarity for understanding. And this creates a particular kind of trouble in close relationships. Because in a relationship, you are not arguing with a stranger. You are arguing with someone whose patterns you have studied, whose tendencies you have cataloged, whose past behavior you can reference. You know them, or you believe you do, and that belief, however loving it is at its core, can quietly become a wall that feels from the inside like wisdom, like earned perspective, like the natural result of paying attention. But there is a version of knowing someone that stops you from actually seeing them. When you are certain you understand someone, you stop being curious about them. You stop asking the real questions. You begin managing the conversation instead of participating in it. You have a model of this person in your mind, a model built from memory and pattern recognition, and without realizing it, you begin responding to the model rather than to the person standing in front of you. This is not a criticism. It happens in almost every close relationship to almost everyone. Familiarity and certainty tend to move together. The longer you know someone, the more confident you become in your read of them, and that confidence in small doses is useful. In larger doses, it becomes the reason you stop hearing what they're actually saying. At first, it seems harmless, a slight overconfidence in your own interpretation, a tendency to fill in their meaning before they've finished offering it. But the accumulation of those moments changes the texture of the relationship in ways that are difficult to trace. Ask yourself this and let it sit without an answer. When was the last time someone you love said something that genuinely surprised you, not annoyed you, not confirmed something you already suspected, surprised you, made you feel for a moment like you were meeting them again for the first time? If that hasn't happened in a while, it may not be because they've stopped having those thoughts. It may be because they've learned what happens when they try to offer them. There is something beneath the need to be right that rarely gets examined. It is not arrogance, or not primarily, it is something closer to fear. The fear that if you are wrong, if you misread the situation, if your version of events is incomplete, if someone else's perception has as much validity as yours, then something else becomes uncertain too. Not just your argument, your self-understanding, your sense of being someone who sees clearly, who handles things well, who can be trusted to know what's actually happening. Being right is not only about winning, it is about staying intact. And this is what makes intellectual humility so difficult to practice in close relationships specifically. Because in a conversation with a stranger, being wrong carries a limited cost. You concede the point and move on. The relationship doesn't carry the weight of your self-image. But in a partnership, in a family, in a friendship that has spanned years, being wrong can feel like destabilizing something much larger. Like admitting that the version of yourself you've been presenting, the careful, reasonable, clear-eyed one, may not be as reliable as you believed. Socrates understood this. He described himself as a kind of midwife, someone who helped people give birth to ideas they already carried but hadn't examined. And the reason this process was often uncomfortable was not because the ideas were bad. It was because examining them meant releasing the certainty that had been wrapped around them. It meant opening a space where things could be different from what you had assumed. And in that open space, the self becomes temporarily uncertain. Most people close that space as quickly as possible, not out of cowardice, out of the completely understandable need to feel like a coherent person. But when you cannot tolerate being wrong, you cannot truly listen. Because real listening, the kind that might change your mind, requires leaving your conclusions open long enough for new information to enter. And that openness, when it involves someone you love, can feel like a kind of vertigo. Part of you already knows this. The resistance to admitting you might be wrong is not usually logical. It doesn't survive careful thought. When you slow down and ask what exactly you are protecting, the answer is almost always something fragile. A self-image, a role, a fear of what happens if the other person realizes you don't have it all figured out. This is the hidden structure of most relational conflict. Two people, both of whom have built their certainty carefully and honestly over time, both of whom are protecting something real, and both of whom have made it almost impossible for the other to be heard. And this is where most people don't notice the shift, because it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like clarity. It feels like precision. It feels like caring enough to get it right. But here is what tends to happen when that fear is finally set aside. When someone says, with genuine openness, "I may have missed something in this," the room changes. Something that was defended becomes available again. People move closer, not away. And the conversation that had been circling the same point for months finds somewhere new to go. The issue is not the argument. It is rarely the specific disagreement. Whether you remembered correctly, whether you were actually late, whether you handled the situation the way you said you did, these details carry weight, but they are not the real terrain. The real terrain is what happens to your sense of self when the facts are uncertain. Socrates spent his life making the case that the examined life was the only life worth living. Not because self-examination is comfortable, it isn't, but because the alternative, moving through life carrying unexamined assumptions about who you are and what you know, is a kind of sleepwalking. It looks like confidence. It can feel like groundedness, but it is, in many cases, a refusal to encounter yourself honestly. And in relationships, this refusal has a particular shape. It shows up as the need to be the one who was right about the diagnosis, the one who remembered the timeline correctly, the one whose interpretation of the conversation is the accurate one. These moments feel small. They happen quickly in the middle of ordinary life, but they accumulate into a pattern. And over time, the pattern communicates something that no single argument ever intended to say. I do not fully trust you to know what's real. Imagine what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that, not once, but repeatedly over months and years. Not to be dismissed exactly, but to have your perception gently, persistently corrected. To have the experience of offering your version of something and watching it be carefully redirected. To learn, slowly and without any single defining moment, that the easiest thing is to agree, or to stop bringing it up at all. That experience doesn't produce anger necessarily. It produces something quieter, withdrawal, the decision, not always conscious, to keep certain things to yourself. And the person on the other side rarely sees it happen, because what they see is less friction, less conflict. What they interpret as growth or maturity in the relationship is sometimes just the other person going silent in a new way. Until something changes, until that silence becomes visible in a different form, distance, disengagement, a flatness in the conversation that wasn't there before. And by then, the person who needed to be right has often lost access to the very thing they were trying to protect, a relationship where the other person still believes they will be heard. The shift that Socrates pointed toward was not about humility as a posture, not as a strategy for appearing more open while actually changing nothing. It was about identity at a deeper level, about becoming someone who genuinely does not know everything and who is curious rather than threatened by that fact. We are taught in countless small ways that certainty is a form of strength, that knowing your own mind is something to protect rather than question. And so by the time we enter close relationships, where not knowing is inevitable, where being genuinely wrong is going to happen, we arrive carrying a self-image that wasn't built for that much honesty. The question isn't whether you can change that overnight. The question is whether you're willing to notice it. There is no instruction here. This is worth naming directly because the natural next step, the one the mind reaches for when it has been gently confronted, is to ask what to do. What is the practice? What are the steps? And those questions are not wrong, but they arrive too quickly. They arrive before something more important has had time to settle. What Socrates was after was not a technique. It was a reorientation. A way of entering a conversation differently, not with the goal of arriving at your conclusion more efficiently, but with genuine openness to the possibility that the conversation might change something in you, that you might leave the exchange with a different understanding than you came in with, not because you were defeated, but because you allowed something in. This is not the same as surrender. It is not the same as abandoning your perspective or pretending you don't have a view. It is the willingness to hold your view the way you hold a hypothesis, with care, but without the need to protect it from examination. To say, even silently, I think this is true, and I am staying open to being wrong. That posture is rarer than it sounds, because it requires tolerating a specific kind of discomfort, the discomfort of not knowing how the conversation is going to land, of not being able to steer it toward a conclusion you've already chosen. Most people, when they feel that discomfort, respond by tightening their grip. by making their case more precisely, more firmly. And this is understandable, but it is almost never what the other person needed. Or maybe it appears differently for you. Maybe you don't argue more forcefully. Maybe you simply go quiet or change the subject or make the disagreement feel resolved before it actually is. The specific shape of avoidance varies. What tends not to vary is the discomfort underneath it and the speed with which we move to make that discomfort stop. You might try noticing just once the moment in a familiar conversation when you feel yourself stop listening and start preparing. That moment when you shift from receiving to positioning. It happens faster than we usually realize, and it is almost always invisible from the inside. You're still nodding, you're still present technically, but the quality of your attention has changed. It has narrowed, it has become selective. Just notice that without immediately correcting it, without turning it into another thing to fix. Because the thing that most consistently changes how we move through conflict is not a new strategy. It is a different relationship to our own certainty. The capacity to sit with "I might be wrong about this" long enough to actually mean it, long enough to feel the ground shift slightly beneath you, and to stay in the conversation anyway. Intellectual humility is not passivity. It is not the absence of conviction. It is a more demanding way to engage, one that requires you to hold two things at once: your own perspective, which is real and worth offering, and the genuine possibility that the person across from you is seeing something you're not. That capacity is rarer than it sounds, and it tends to change everything it touches. Socrates was sentenced to death for asking questions. Not for being wrong, not for saying things that were demonstrably false, for refusing to stop examining, for insisting in a city that had grown comfortable with its certainties that the unquestioned life was the one worth worrying about. There is something in that worth carrying into the quiet of an ordinary disagreement. The person across from you is not your opponent. They are the only one who can tell you what you look like from the outside, and that is, if you are willing to receive it, one of the most valuable things anyone can offer. Intellectual humility does not look like weakness from the outside. When it is real, not performed, not strategic, but genuinely felt, it looks like presence. Like someone who is actually in the conversation rather than managing it. Like someone whose ego has grown quiet enough to hear what's being said. This is not a destination. It is a practice with no final arrival point. There will be moments when the need to be right returns with its full force. When the argument matters, when the memory is clear, when walking away from your position feels like losing something essential. In those moments, the question Socrates asked is still available. What do I actually know, and what am I only certain of? The distance between those two things is where real understanding tends to live. And it is, for most of us, a distance we have barely begun to cross.